According to Immanuel Kant, our interest in reason, and thereby the overarching interest of philosophy, can be distilled into three questions. What can I know? What must I do? And what may I hope? This video uncovers his answer to each of these questions, one after the other. First, however, let's delve into his biography to better understand where his thoughts come from. Kant was born in April 1724 in Königsberg. There he studied philosophy, mathematics, and theology. In 1755, he became a private lecturer, and in 1770, a professor of philosophy. All of this took place in his hometown of Königsberg, where he spent his entire life. Kant was not a philosophical child prodigy like Leibniz, but rather a late bloomer. When he published his first major work, The Critique of Pure Reason, he was almost 60 years old, and nearly 80 by his last publication. Consequently, Kant is almost always envisioned as an old and often somewhat eccentric man. What is overlooked is that there is also a young Kant and a life before The Critique of Reason. While philosophically less significant, it is more vibrant than Kant is commonly credited for. The liveliest years were likely his time as a private lecturer. Kant used to go out almost every evening and was well received in Königsberg's high society, despite not being of noble birth. The ladies referred to him as the elegant magister. However, he never entered a relationship. Twice he came close to marriage, but both times he later claimed he thought too long about it. Once there was a well-mannered, gentle, and beautiful widow from out of town visiting relatives. Kant did not deny that she was a woman he would like to live with. He calculated income and expenses, postponing the decision day by day. The beautiful widow visited other relatives in the meantime and married there. A second attempt failed similarly. After that, Kant never thought about marriage again. Later, he remarked that when he needed a wife, he couldn't afford one, and when he could afford one, he no longer needed one. Around the year 1764, at the age of 40, Kant experienced what we would now call a midlife crisis. He decided to give his hitherto relatively uncommitted life firm principles and rules. Only from this time onwards did his lifestyle become as it is usually described: principled, strictly regulated, and at last, pedantic. His daily routine was always the same, down to the minute. Kant would precisely wake up at 5 in the morning and go to bed just as precisely at 10 p.m., punctually and every day. This was, in a sense, quite sensible, because this regulated and energy-conserving lifestyle provided the stable external framework that made Kant's great philosophical achievement possible. This achievement began only now, and Kant had to wrest it from his frail physical constitution. Nevertheless, this strictly regulated and distraction-free way of life certainly proved beneficial. The following years from 1770 to around 1800 were the ones in which Kant developed the thoughts that made him world famous. The first question, what can I know, concerns our understanding of reality, that is, the world in which we live. Kant's answer may be summarized as, I can know what my senses and my reason, working together, convey to me. Knowledge is thus a product of sensory data and reason. This is Kant's first major discovery. Our tools of understanding, primarily reason, do not merely reflect external impressions one-to-one. Instead, they always impart a certain form to them, such as arranging all perceptions in space and time. The fact that we perceive things as adjacent or superimposed and as simultaneous or sequential is not inherent in the things themselves, but in the ordering system we superimpose on them. This means that we shape the form of our knowledge ourselves. Consequently, we also bring forth the world as we perceive it, at least in part. This reversal of the common worldview is called the Copernican revolution in epistemology. Similar to how the astronomer Nicholas Copernicus demonstrated that contrary to appearances, it is not the sun that revolves around the earth, but the earth around the sun. Kant now showed that the world is not merely depicted by our cognition, but it is brought forth by our cognition, at least in terms of its form. The world is thus not a world of things in themselves, but a world of appearances, a world as it appears to us. However, this does not mean that the world is merely an illusion. What we recognize is reality, but it is our reality, shaped by our own cognitive processes. Equally striking was another conclusion of Kant that, if knowledge of reality only arises through the interplay of senses and reason, then wherever one of these components is lacking, one cannot speak of knowledge. Mere thinking, for example, is not knowledge. I can imagine many things, but I only know that something is real when I also perceive it with my senses. Only then does thinking acquire real substance and become knowledge. Until then, it may just be that I have only played with thoughts. For Kant, the second of the major questions of reason was the most important. What must I do? It is the question of ethical action. According to Kant, this can only be moral action commanded by our reason. Ethics forms the core of his philosophy and its fundamental law, as Kant formulated it in his Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, is the famous categorical imperative. Act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. The categorical imperative does not command or forbid specific actions, such as honor your father and your mother, or thou shalt not kill. Instead, it provides an abstract guideline for the maxims of our will, to act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Maxims refer to personal principles of action, such as, I want to help people in need, or I want to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, or I want to quit smoking. Whether these maxims are moral or not depends on whether they could be considered as principles of a universal law. In other words, would it be good if all people were required to always behave in the same way everywhere and, as expressed by the respective maxim, as if that maxim were a natural law? If the answer to this question is yes, the maxim is moral. If not, it is not. Whether this suitability for a universal law exists or not can be recognized through a test that Kant calls universalization. Universalization is carried out from two perspectives. First, the maxim can be thought of coherently as a general law, according to which all people must always and everywhere behave. And second, all people can reasonably want this. A maxim like, I want to help people in need, passes this test. The idea that all people should always and everywhere follow this maxim, that is, help people in need, contains no inherent contradiction. It is also reasonable to assume that all people could want such a law, as anyone may someday rely on the help of others. Therefore, we can conclude that the maxim, I want to help people in need, is universalizable and thus moral. A counterexample is a maxim like, I want to deceive people. I cannot want this as a general law, nor can I think of it coherently. I cannot want it because under such a general law, I would have to expect to become a victim of deception myself. And I cannot think of it because universal deceit would soon destroy the trust which is necessary for deception. This maxim would make itself impossible through its universalization, meaning it contains an internal contradiction and is immoral for this reason. The focus on maxims also highlights that Kant's ethics is an ethics of the will. The decisive factor for moral judgment is goodwill, not the success of a particular action. This is because only the will is under our control and, therefore, under our moral responsibility. The execution of the action, on the other hand, depends on various external circumstances that we cannot influence, such as our natural strengths and abilities or available resources. For example, if someone is in danger of drowning and I cannot swim, I am not morally obligated to jump into the water. However, I must do everything else to save that person, such as throwing a life buoy into the water, calling for help, and so on. If the rescue is still too late despite all efforts because nobody jumped into the water on time, I bear no moral guilt for that. This is also exactly why, today, most countries have a Good Samaritan law. What matters is the goodwill, which Kant thinks is the only thing that is intrinsically valuable. However, the goodwill must not be mere wishing. Just thinking that one really should help this poor person now is not enough. The goodwill must include setting everything in motion to realize the good intention. This is what the categorical imperative demands of us. It is Kant's fundamental answer to the question, what should I do? When Kant developed these groundbreaking thoughts, he was not only at the peak of his philosophical work, but also at the height of his external circumstances. In 1783, he could afford his own house, and from 1786, also a housekeeper, so he no longer had to eat out and proudly noted that he had his own household. Kant now received daily guests for lunch, mostly friends from Königsberg, but also visitors from outside. The table conversations were said to be lively and stimulating. However, like the menu, they were precisely regulated and divided into 3 courses. The appetizer was for information, the main course for reasoning, and dessert for jesting, categorically, so to speak. According to unanimous testimony of many guests, Kant was able to participate well in all 3 fields. From the categorical imperative, Kant developed further principles that continue to shape our coexistence to this day. One of the most important is the categorical imperative of law, which states that I may consider myself a free individual and fundamentally do not need anyone to dictate to me what I should or should not do. However, this applies only as long as I do not thereby impede the freedom of another. When that is the case, the determination is not made by me or the other person, but by a general law that applies equally to all citizens of my community. This is the fundamental idea of a liberal legal order, as enshrined in many constitutions today. Kant also extends this idea to the coexistence of nations. In his work Perpetual Peace from 1795, he proposes to establish a League of Nations to peacefully resolve conflicts between states. 150 years later, this idea was at the forefront during the founding of the United Nations. The categorical, unconditional moral self-obligation is also Kant's justification for human dignity, because this moral disposition sets humans apart from all other living beings, who, as far as we can judge, only follow their natural instincts. This means they always remain within the natural context of causes and effects and cannot be held responsible for their actions. Only humans, through their unconditional moral obligation, are elevated from this context of conditions and thereby demonstrate themselves as free and capable of responsibility. For this reason, humans possess an unconditional and therefore inviolable dignity. What this means for our interaction with other people is expressed in Kant's principle of humanity. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. What this means is that we are allowed to use another person for our own purposes. For example, hiring a craftsman to repair a washing machine or a waiter to fetch food and drinks. However, we must not view them solely as a means for these purposes, but must always respect them as an end in themselves, as individuals who exist for their own sake and possess an unconditional, absolute dignity. And we should accordingly treat them with the respect they deserve, precisely because they are human. From around 1796, Kant's strengths began to decline. He experienced physical and mental deterioration initially slowly starting around 1800 and then more rapidly. He passed away on the 12th of February, 1804. His funeral was a major social event in Königsberg. However, higher-ranking representatives of the government or the church did not attend. Kant had fallen out of favor with both during the last years of his philosophical career. His enthusiasm for the French Revolution, and in particular his work Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason from 1793, had earned him a formal reprimand from the royal censorship authorities. According to Kant, the ritualistic actions of religion, such as worship and prayer, only make sense as instruments of morality, as tools to make people receptive to morality. Taken on their own, without this moral intent, they should be rejected as attempts to win over God in the simplest and most convenient way. According to Kant, the only true worship of God consists of moral actions. Kant was not a friend of the church, but he was not indifferent to religion. On the contrary, religion, in his view, provides the answer to the third great question of our reason: what may I hope? However, this answer does not arise from the Bible or other holy scriptures, but from the moral law within us. If reason commands us to act morally through the categorical imperative, then this must lead to a meaningful goal. Otherwise, this rational command would be senseless and therefore irrational. In the world we live, we cannot recognize such a goal. Therefore, we are allowed to hope for a different future world, where the circumstances will be reversed and the good people will be better off than the wicked. Through our moral actions, we contribute to achieving this goal. However, we cannot create such a world where morality and happiness are in just relationship on our own. It requires a creator who is all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing. This can only be God. At this point, Kant's ethics transitions into the philosophy of religion, which places the wide horizon of hope alongside strict duty. It serves as something of a legacy from Kant. Based on our moral reason, we are allowed to hope and trust that God exists, and that, in the end, he will create a world where evil does not have the last word.